Hey everyone, welcome to Hands On Books. This will be part 2 of selections from Salammbô. If you missed part 1 and you like it, this is one of my favorite books, and these are just passages that I particularly like and I think give a really great flavor of Flaubert's just absolute mastery. So let's dive back in. This is a scene where Hamilcar has returned and is trying to take account of how much entertaining the mercenaries has cost him. And he's got his assistant, Abdelanim, who is his sort of, I guess, seneschal. And this scene really stuck with me from the first time I read Salammbô, just the picture of Hamilcar's treasure house that Flaubert paints. Hamilcar says, "But I do not here see the megara expenses," meaning the ones from entertaining the mercenaries. Abdelanim turned pale, as he brought from another pigeonhole the sycamore wood tablets filed in bundles and tied together with leather straps. Hamilcar listened, curious as to the domestic details, and calmed by the monotony of the man's voice as he enumerated the accounts, while Abdelanim read slower and slower. Suddenly, letting the wooden tablets fall to the ground, he threw himself flat on his face with arms extended in the position of one condemned. Hamilcar, without evincing any emotion, picked up the tablets. His lips parted, and his eyes opened wide as he saw charged as the expenses of a single day an exorbitant amount of meats, fish, birds, wines, and aromatics, vases broken, slaves killed, and napery destroyed. Abdelanim, remaining prostrate, told him of the barbarian's feast, and that he had been unable to escape from obeying the commands. Here's the artwork of the storehouse that we're about to witness. He had been unable to escape from obeying the commands of the elders. Salammbô, too, had commanded that money should be lavished to receive the soldiers. At the name of his daughter, Hamilcar jumped up. Then, compressing his lips, he sank back amid the cushions, tearing the fringes with his nails, his eyes fixed, panting. "Arise," said the Safite. Then he descended from the dais, followed by Abdelanim, whose knees trembled. But seizing an iron bar, he went to work like a madman to unseal the pavement. A disk of wood flew out and revealed, under the entire length of the passage, numerous broad covers that concealed pits where grain was stored. "Eye of Baal, you see by this," said the servant, trembling, "they have not taken everything, for these pits are deep, each one 50 cubits, and full to the brim. During your absence, I have had similar pits dug in the arsenals and in the gardens, so that your mansion is as full of grain as your heart is of wisdom." A smile passed over Hamilcar's face. "It is well, Abdelanim." Afterward he whispered, "You must obtain grain from Etruria and Bruttium, and from whatever place you can and at any price. Amass it and keep it stored. It is important that I alone possess all the grain in Carthage." Then, when they reached the end of the passage, Abdelanim, with one of the keys hanging from his girdle, opened a large quadrangular room, divided in the center by cedar pillars. Gold, silver, and brass coins were piled on tables, or stacked in niches that extended the length of the 4 walls, reaching up to the beams of the roof. Enormous coffers of hippopotamus hide stood in the corners, supporting rows of smaller bags, and bullion heaped up made hillocks on the pavement, while here and there piles too high had toppled over, appearing like columns in ruins. The large pieces of Carthaginian money, stamped on the face with a representation of Tanit and a horse under a palm tree, were mixed with those of the colonies on which were stamped the figure of a bull, a star, a globe, or a crescent. Then, disposed about in unequal amounts, were pieces of all values and dimensions and ages, from the ancient ones of Assyria that were as thin as a fingernail, to the old ones of Latium that were thicker than a hand. There were also the buttons of Aegina, the tablets of Bactria, and the short bars of ancient Lacedaemonia. The coins were rusty, greasy with dirt. Many were covered with verdigris, having been fished up out of water in nets. Others were blackened by fire, having been found after sieges in the midst of ruins. The Safite had quickly calculated whether the present sums corresponded with the gains and losses that had just been submitted to him, and he was about proceeding when he discovered 3 brass jars completely empty. Abdelanim averted his head with a sign of horror, and Hamilcar resigned himself in silence. I guess that's the expected embezzlement on the part of Abdelanim. They crossed other passages and other halls, coming at last before a door where, to guard it the better, a man was fastened about the waist to a long chain, riveted in the masonry of the wall. A Roman custom but lately introduced into Carthage. His beard and nails had grown excessively long, and he swayed from right to left, with a continued oscillation, like that of a captive animal. As soon as he recognized Hamilcar, he cried out, "Mercy, Eye of Baal! Pity! Kill me! It is now 10 years since I have seen the sun. In the name of your father, mercy!" Without answering him, Hamilcar clapped his hands. 3 men appeared, who, with the assistance of Abdelanim, set at once to work, straining their arms in the effort to release from its ring the enormous bar securing the door. Hamilcar took a torch and disappeared in the darkness. This was believed to be a passage leading to the family sepulchre, but only a wide pit would have been found, which was excavated to mislead thieves, and in reality concealed nothing. Hamilcar passed it, then, leaning down, turned aside on its rollers a very heavy millstone. There was revealed an opening through which he entered an apartment built in the form of a cone. The walls were covered with brass scales. In the center, on a granite pedestal, was a statue of one of the Kabiri, bearing the name of Aletes, the discoverer of the mines in Celtiberia. Against the base of the statue, on the ground, were placed crosswise broad golden bucklers, and monstrous silver vases with closed necks, all of such an extravagant form as to make them useless, it being the custom to cast such quantities of metal in these objects as to render it next to impossible to embezzle or even move them. With his torch he lighted a small miner's lamp fixed in the idol's cap. Immediately the hall was illuminated with green, yellow, blue, violet, wine, and blood-colored lights, for it was filled with precious stones placed in golden calabashes hanging like sconces to brass plates, or in their native blocks ranged along at the base of the walls. Here were to be found in abundance turquoises shot away from the mountains by the swirl of a sling, carbuncles formed by lynx's urine, tongue-like stones fallen from the moon, tyanos, diamonds, syndastrum, beryls, the 3 varieties of ruby, the 4 species of sapphires, and the 12 kinds of emeralds. These precious stones flashed variously like splashes of milk, blue icicles, or silver dust, and threw their rays in sheets, in beams, or like twinkling stars. The Charania engendered by the thunder scintillated near the chalcedonies, antidotes to poisons. There were topazes from Zabarca, effective in warding off terrors, opals from Bactria, employed to prevent abortions, and horns of Ammon, which invite dreams when placed beneath a bed. The fantastic fires from the gems and the flames from the lamp were mirrored in the broad gold shields. Hamilcar stood with folded arms, smiling, and he reveled less in the spectacle than in the consciousness of his riches. They were inaccessible, inexhaustible, infinite. The thought of his ancestors sleeping beneath his feet sent thrilling to his heart some conception of their eternity. He felt drawn very near to the subterranean spirits. He experienced an emotion akin to the joy of a Kabir, and the large luminous rays, striking his face, resembled the end of an invisible network that crossed abysses and attached him to the center of the world. An idea came which made him shiver. He went behind the idol, and walked straight therefrom to the wall. He searched on his arm amid numerous tattooings, examining a horizontal line with 2 perpendicular lines, which in Canaanite figures expressed 13. Then he counted to the 13th brass plate on the wall, when he again lifted his sleeve, and with his right hand traced on another part of his arm other lines more complicated, delicately moving his fingers as if he played upon a lyre. Finally, he struck 7 blows with his thumb, at which one entire section of the wall turned around as a single block. This concealed a sort of cellar, in which were enclosed mysterious things that possessed no names, but of an incalculable value. Hamilcar descended the 3 steps, took from a silver vat an antelope skin that floated in a black liquid, and then reascended. It's just like so mysterious and keeps going and going and going. Beautiful. Okay, next. Yeah, here's another battle scene, which doesn't get much better than battle scenes in this book. And this is when Hamilcar is able to ford a stream that the mercenaries thought couldn't be crossed, and so he surprises them after crossing it at night, ready for a battle. The barbarians encamped at Utica, and the 15,000 around the bridge were surprised to see the ground undulating in the distance. The wind, which was blowing briskly, chased tornadoes of dust. They rose as if detached from the soil in large golden pillars, then parted asunder, always beginning again, and thus hiding from the view of the mercenaries the Punic army. The effect produced by the horns placed on the side of the casks caused some to believe that they perceived a herd of cattle. Others, deceived by the fluttering mantles, pretended to distinguish wings, and those who had traveled much shrugged their shoulders, saying that it was the illusion of the mirage. Still something subtle of enormous size continued to advance. Little vapors, as breaths, floated over the surface of the desert. The sun, now much higher, shone powerfully. A fierce glare which seemed to quiver made the depth of the sky more profound, and permeating objects rendered the distance incalculable. The immense plain unfolded on all sides beyond the reach of vision, and the almost invisible undulations of the ground were prolonged to the extreme horizon, closed in by the long blue line which they knew to be the sea. The 2 armies went forth from their tents to gaze, and the people of Utica crowded upon the ramparts. They distinguished many transverse bars bristling with even points. These became thicker and larger. Black hillocks swayed. Suddenly square bushes appeared. They were the elephants and the lances. A single yell burst forth. "The Carthaginians!" And, without signal or command, the soldiers at Utica and those stationed at the bridge made a dash pell-mell to fall in one body upon Hamilcar. Spendius shuddered and breathlessly repeated, "Hamilcar! Hamilcar!" And Matho was not there. What should be done? No means for flight. The surprise of this event, his terror of the Safite, and above all the urgency for an immediate resolution, upset him. He could see himself slashed by 1,000 swords, decapitated, dead. Meanwhile they called for him. 30,000 men were ready to follow his leadership. A fury against himself seized him, and he fell back upon the hope of victory. It was full of delight, and he fancied himself braver than Epaminondas. To hide his pallor he smeared his cheeks with vermilion, then he buckled on his greaves and cuirass, swallowed a cup of pure wine, and ran hotly after his troops, who had hastened toward those of Utica. They united so rapidly that the Safite had not time to range his men in line of battle. Gradually he slackened his pace. The elephants stopped, swaying their heavy heads, covered with ostrich plumes, and beating their shoulders with their trunks. Yeah, one thing is Flaubert always gives a really good idea of how quickly these sorts of battles can change, and you think one side has an advantage and they might for a little while, but then everything completely changes and then they lose. So it's always this very back and forth thing. At the back through the intervals could be distinguished the cohorts of velites, and further on, the large helmets of the Clinabarians, with polished weapons that glittered under the sun's rays, cuirasses, plumes, and waving standards. But the Punic army, all told numbering only 11,396 men, seemed scarcely to contain so many, for it formed a long square, narrowed at the flank and closed up on itself. Seeing them so weak, the barbarians were possessed with a riotous joy, for they were 3 times the number of the enemy. And yet no one had discerned Hamilcar. He had perhaps remained behind. What difference, after all? The disdain that they had for these merchant soldiers reinforced their courage, and before Spendius could command the maneuver, it had all been anticipated and already executed. They deployed in a long straight line that overlapped the wings of the Punic army, in order to completely encompass it. But when they were not more than 300 paces apart, the elephants, instead of advancing, turned back. Then behold, the Clinabarians wheeled round and followed them. And the surprise of the mercenaries was great when they perceived all the archers running to rejoin them. The Carthaginians were afraid. They were flying. A formidable hooting burst out among the barbarian troops, and from the back of his dromedary Spendius cried out, "Ah, I knew it well! Advance! Forward!" They launched forth instantaneously, through the air, streams of javelins and darts and balls from whirring slings. The elephants, galled on their haunches by the flying arrows, galloped rapidly and stirred up a great dust, presently vanishing like shadows in a cloud. Far beyond could be distinguished a loud noise of tramping, predominated by the shrill blare of trumpets blown furiously. The spaces before the barbarians, full of eddies and tumult, drew them in like a whirlpool, and some dashed headlong into it. Some infantry cohorts appeared. They closed their ranks, and simultaneously all the others saw the foot soldiers running with the galloping cavalry. Hamilcar had ordered the phalanx to break its section for the elephants, light infantry, and cavalry to pass through these intervals, in order to take up their stations quickly on the wings. And he had so exactly calculated the distance from the barbarians that at the moment when they came within reach, the entire Carthaginian army was reformed in a straight line. In the center bristled the phalanx, formed in syntagmata or perfect squares, having 16 men on each side. All the file leaders appeared between the long sharp points, which jutted unequally above them, for the first 6 ranks crossed their sarissas, holding them in the middle, and the 10 lower ranks supported theirs on the shoulders of their comrades immediately before them. Their faces were half hidden under the visors of their casques, bronze greaves covered their right legs, and broad cylindrical shields reached down to their knees, and this awful quadrangular mass, moving as a single piece, seemed to possess the life of an animal and the functions of a machine. It was flanked by 2 cohorts of elephants, and the huge creatures kept shaking themselves to detach the splinters of the arrows sticking in their black hides. The Indians, crouching on their necks amid tufts of white plumes, guided them with the spoon-shaped end of the harpoons they wielded, while in the towers men concealed as far as their shoulders waved, behind the great bent bows, iron holders containing burning tow. On the right and left of the elephants hovered the slingers, each with a sling around his head, another about his loins, and a third in his right hand. Then came the Clinabarians, each one flanked by a Negro, holding their lances between the ears of their horses, covered, like their riders, with gold. Following at intervals came the light-armed soldiers, with bucklers of lynx skin, over which projected the points of the javelins which they held in their left hands, and the Tarentines, each managing 2 horses coupled together, finished off at both extremities this wall of soldiers. The barbarian army, on the contrary, had not been able to maintain its line. Its enormous length wavered and opened out in gaps, all panted, breathless from running. The phalanx swayed heavily as it thrust forward all its sarissas. Under the tremendous weight, the mercenaries' thin lines gave way in the middle. The Carthaginian wings opened out to seize them. The elephants followed. With lances held obliquely, the phalanx cut the barbarians in 2. Both the enormous bodies were shaken. The wings, with volleys of arrows and balls, drove them back against the phalangites. The cavalry failed to disengage itself, with the exception of 200 Numidians, who charged the right squadron of the Clinabarians. All the others were hemmed in and could not escape from the lines. Destruction was imminent, and the necessity of coming to some resolution urgent. Spendius commanded an attack on both flanks of the phalanx to be made simultaneously, so as to force a passage right through it. But the narrowest ranks glided within the longer ones, returning to their position, and the phalanx wheeled to meet the barbarians, as terrible on its flanks as it had been just before on its front. They struck against the staves of the sarissas. The cavalry in the rear foiled their attack, and the phalanx, supported by the elephants, kept closing up and extending, and presented successively a square, a cone, a rhombus, a trapezium, and a pyramid. A double interior movement was continuously being made from its front to its rear, as those who were at the end of the files ran toward the first ranks, while those who were fatigued or wounded fell back to the base. The barbarians found themselves crowded onto the phalanx. It was impossible for it to advance. The field of action appeared like an ocean whereon were tossing red plumes and bronze scales, while the bright bucklers rolled like silver foam. Sometimes, from end to end, wide currents would descend and then ascend, while in the center a dense mass remained motionless. The lances dipped and rose alternately. Elsewhere was so rapid a movement of naked blades that only the points could be distinguished, and the cavalry troops swept in wide circles which closed up behind them in eddies. Above the captains' voices, the blare of the clarions and the twanging of lyres, leaden bullets and almond-shaped pellets of clay whistled through the air, smiting swords from hands and making brains leap from skulls. The wounded, sheltering themselves with one arm under their shields, pointed their swords while the pommel rested on the ground, and others, writhing in pools of blood, turned to bite the passers' heels. The multitude was so compact, the dust so thick, the tumult so deafening, that it was impossible to distinguish anything clearly. The cowards who offered to surrender were not even heard. When men were disarmed, they gripped body to body, and breasts cracked against the cuirasses, and the heads of the corpses hung backward between nerveless arms. There was a company of 60 Umbrians who, firm on their legs, their pikes advanced before their eyes, unshaken and grinding their teeth, cut down and forced back 2 centigmata at once. The Epirot shepherds ran to the left squadron of the Clinibarians, seized their horses by the manes, twisting their clubs in them, till the tortured animals, throwing their riders, fled across the plain. The Punic slingers, scattered here and there, stood agape. The phalanx began to waver, the captains ran about distracted, the rear ranks pressed on the soldiers, and the barbarians had reformed their lines. They returned to the charge, the victory was within reach. But a cry, one frightful shriek, burst out, a roar of pain and rage. It came from the 72 elephants charging in a double line. Hamilcar had waited until the mercenaries were massed in a single spot before loosing the elephants upon them. The Indians had goaded them so cruelly that the blood ran over their large ears. Their trunks were bedaubed with minium, and they held them straight in the air like red serpents. To their breasts were fashioned boar spears. Their backs were protected by cuirasses, their tusks elongated with iron blades curved like sabers, and to render them more ferocious, they had been intoxicated with a mixture of pepper, pure wine, and incense. They shook their necklaces of bells, shrieking, and the elephantarchs lowered their heads to avoid the stream of flaming darts which began to fly from the tops of the towers. I love the idea of the elephant's tusks being sheathed in blades. In order to resist the charge more effectually, the barbarians closed up in a compact body. The elephants dashed themselves impetuously into the middle of it. The boar spears attached to their breasts like the prows of ships clove through the cohorts, which fell back in great waves. With their trunks the elephants kept strangling men, or, snatching them from the ground, held them above their heads and delivered them to the soldiers in the tower. With their tusks they disemboweled their victims and tossed their bodies in the air, while long entrails hung from their ivory tusks like bundles of cordage from masts. So brutal. The barbarians endeavored to blind them or hamstring them. Others glided under their bodies and plunged their blades up to the hilts, but were crushed beneath the falling animals and perished. The more intrepid clutched on to their girths, under the downpouring volley of flames, balls, and arrows, and continued to sever the leather till the wicker towers rolled off like a tower of stones. 14 elephants on the extreme right, maddened by their wounds, turned on the second line. The Indians seized their mallets and chisels, and applying them to the neck joint, with all their force struck one mighty blow. Down sank the enormous animals, falling one upon another, forming almost a mountain, and on the heap of carcasses and armor, a monstrous elephant, called Fury of Baal, caught by the leg among the chains, trumpeted till evening with an arrow in his eye. Meanwhile the others, like conquerors who delight in the extermination of their foes, were overthrowing, crushing, stamping, venting their fury on the corpses and on the wreckage. In order to repel them, the companies pressed around them in close circles, but they turned on their hind feet in a continual rotary movement, always advancing. The Carthaginians felt their strength multiply, and the battle raged again. I don't like the scene so much where the animals are getting hurt, but still an amazing battle scene. And here is a depiction of a siege. The northern and eastern sides, being protected by the sea and the gulf, were inaccessible. On the wall facing the barbarians were piled up tree trunks, millstones, vases full of sulfur, vats full of oil, and furnaces were built. Stones were heaped up on the platforms of the towers, and the houses immediately adjacent to the ramparts were crammed with sand to increase their strength and thickness. The sight of all these preparations angered the barbarians. They wanted to engage in combat at once. The weights they put into the catapults were so excessively heavy that the beams broke, thereby delaying the attack. Finally, on the 13th day of the month of Shamar, at sunrise, a tremendous blow was heard at the gates of Khamûn. 75 soldiers were hauling ropes arranged at the base of a gigantic beam horizontally suspended by chains, descended from a gallows and terminating in a brazen ram's head. It was swathed in hides, bands of iron encircled it from place to place, and it was 3 times thicker than a man's body, 120 cubits long, and it advanced or receded under the crowd of naked arms, pushing it forward or hauling it backward with a regular swing. The rams before the other gates also began to move. In the hollow wheels of the drums men might be seen ascending step by step. The pulleys and capstans creaked, the rope screens were lowered, and volleys of stones and arrows simultaneously shot forth. All the scattered slingers ran up, some of them approached the ramparts, carrying hidden under their shields pots of lighted resin. Then they hurled them down with all their might upon the enemy. The terrific hail of balls, darts, and fire passed beyond the front ranks in a curve that made it fall within the walls, but on their summits were erected huge cranes, such as were used for masting vessels. From them descended enormous pincers, ending in 2 semicircles, toothed on the inside edge. These bit the rams. The soldiers, clinging to the beam, dragged it back. The Carthaginians panted in their efforts to haul it up, and the struggle continued till evening. I love that image of the cranes lowering down and grabbing the battering rams. All right. This is the last part that I marked to read, and I think this is the description of the Holocaust, or the sacrificing of children that the Carthaginians were famous for in the ancient world. And apparently they found evidence of this archaeologically in a lot of different places. Meantime, the Carthaginians, who were consumed by thirst, had rushed to the cisterns. They broke open the doors. At the bottom lay a muddy puddle. What would happen now? The barbarians were innumerable, and when they had recovered from their fatigue would begin again. All night the people deliberated in groups at the street corners. Some said that they must send away the women, the sick, and the aged. Others proposed to abandon the town and establish a new colony far away. But ships were wanting. The sun rose, and no decision had been reached. That day there was no fighting, everyone being exhausted. The people slept as if they were dead. When the Carthaginians reflected upon the cause of their disasters, they remembered that they had neglected to send to Phoenicia the annual offering due to the Tyrian Melkart, and a vast terror seized them. The gods were indignant with the Republic, and would doubtless pursue her with vengeance. The divinities were considered in the light of cruel masters, only to be appeased with supplications and bribed by gifts. All were weak before Moloch, the devourer. Human existence, even the flesh of mankind, belonged to him. Therefore, to preserve it, the Carthaginians were wont to offer a portion of it to him, which calmed his wrath. Children were burned on their foreheads or on the napes of their necks with woolen wicks, and this custom of seeking to satisfy the Baal brought considerable money to the priests. they rarely failed to recommend the easiest and least painful method of sacrifice. But now it was a question of the very existence of the Republic, and as every profit must be purchased by some loss, and every transaction is regulated by the requirements of the weaker and the demands of the stronger, there was no suffering too great for the god, since he took delight in the most horrible, and they all were now at his mercy. He must therefore be completely satiated. Precedent showed that carnal sacrifices to him had compelled the scourge to disappear. Besides, it was believed an immolation by fire would purify Carthage. The ferocity of the people was in favor of it beforehand, inasmuch as the choice of victims must fall exclusively on the great families. The elders assembled. Their session was long. Hanno was present, but as he was now unable to sit up, he remained lying near the entrance, half hidden in the fringes of the lofty tapestry. And when the pontiff of Moloch asked if those convened consented to deliver up their children, his voice suddenly broke forth from the shadows as the roaring of a spirit out of the depths of a cavern. He regretted, he said, that he had none of his own blood to give, and he significantly looked at Hamilcar, who faced him at the other end of the hall. The implication meaning that Hamilcar would need to sacrifice Hannibal. The Suffete was so disturbed by this gaze that he lowered his eyes. All approved by nodding their heads successfully, and, according to the rites, he had to reply to the high priest, "Yes, so be it." Then the elders decreed the sacrifice by traditional periphrasis, for there are things more difficult to say than to do. The decision was made known throughout Carthage, and lamentations resounded. Everywhere women were heard crying. Their husbands either consoled them or heaped invectives upon them for offering remonstrance. 3 hours afterwards, extraordinary news was spread among the people. The Suffete had discovered springs at the base of the cliff. All rushed to the place. Holes had been dug in the sand, showing water, and already some were lying flat on their bellies drinking. Hamilcar did not himself know whether it was an inspiration from the gods or the indistinct recollection of a revelation his father had formerly made to him. But on leaving the conference of elders, he had gone down to the beach with his slaves and begun digging in the gravel. He distributed clothing, shoes, and wine, and the balance of the grain stored in his vaults. He even admitted the populace to his palace, opening the kitchens, magazines, and all the rooms except Salammbô's. He announced that 6,000 Gallic mercenaries were coming, and that the king of Macedonia was also sending soldiers. On the second day, after the discovery of the springs, the volume of water had considerably diminished, and on the evening of the third day they were completely dry. Then the elders' former decree circulated anew on all lips, and the priests of Moloch began preparations for the sacrifice. Men in black robes presented themselves at the houses. Many of the inhabitants had deserted them on pretense of business, or of some dainty that they must buy. The servitors of Moloch came and took the children. Others, stupidly scared, delivered them up. They were all conveyed to the temple of Tanit, to the priestesses, who were ordered to amuse and feed them until the solemn day. They arrived suddenly at Hamilcar's palace, and finding him in his garden, said, "Barca, you know for what we have come. Your son." They added that some people had met the boy one night during the last moon, in the middle of Maples, led by an old man. At first he felt as though his breath had been taken from him, but quickly realizing that denial would be in vain, he bowed his head and introduced them into his house of commerce. His slaves, at a gesture from him, ran to keep watch around him. He entered Salammbô's room in a frenzy, seized Hannibal by one hand, and with the other tore from a trailing robe some strings, with which he fastened the boy's hands and feet together, placing the ends of the strings in his mouth as a gag, and hid him under the cowhide couch, arranging some wide drapery so that it fell all about the couch to the floor. Then he paced up and down the room, raised his arms, wheeled around, bit his lips, then halted, with his eyes fixed, and gasping as though he were dying. At length he clapped his hand 3 times. Giddenem appeared. "Listen," said he. "Go and take from amongst the slaves a male child of 8 or 9 years, with black hair and a swelling forehead. Bring him here. Hasten." Giddenem soon returned and presented a boy. He was a wretched child, at once thin and bloated, his skin grayish, like the loathsome rags that clung to his loins. He hung his head and rubbed his eyes, which were full of flies, with the back of his hands. How could anyone possibly take him for Hannibal? There is no time to choose another. Hamilcar looked at Giddenem, wishing to strangle him. "Go!" cried he, and the master of slaves fled. The sorrow which the Safite had so long a time apprehended had come, and he sought with immeasurable efforts to discern if there were no manner, no way of averting it. Abdelanim spoke from the other side of the door. The servitors of Moloch were becoming impatient and asked for the Safite. Hamilcar suppressed a cry. He experienced a pang akin to the seething burn from a red-hot iron. He began anew to pace the floor like a madman. Then he sank down near the balustrade, and with his elbows on his knees, pressed his temples between his clenched hands. The porphyry basin still contained a small quantity of clean water for Salammbô's ablutions. Despite his repugnance and all his pride, the Safite plunged the slave's child into the basin, and like a slave merchant washed and scrubbed the boy with strigils and red earth. Then he took from the cases surrounding the walls 2 squares of purple. Of these he put one on the child's breast, the other on his back, pinning them over the collarbone with 2 diamond agrafes. He poured perfumes over his head, clasped an electrum necklace around his throat, and thrust his plebeian feet into sandals with pearl heels, his daughter's own sandals. But he stamped with shame and anger. Salammbô, who was earnestly assisting him, was quite as pale as he. The child smiled, pleased with these splendors, and even, growing bolder, began to clap his hands and jump when Hamilcar led him forth. He held him firmly by the arm, as if he feared he should lose him, and the child, hurt by the fierce grasp, whimpered slightly as he ran beside the Safite. Abreast of the ergastulum, under a palm tree, a voice rose, a lamenting, supplicating voice, murmuring, "Master, O master!" Hamilcar turned, and saw at his side a man most abject in appearance, one of the wretches who lived a haphazard existence in his gardens. "What do you want?" asked the Safite. The slave, trembling horribly, stammered, "I am his father." Hamilcar kept on walking. The slave followed, with bent back and head thrust forward. His face was convulsed by an indescribable agony, and his suppressed sobs stifled him. So anxious was he at once to question him and to cry out, "Mercy!" At length he dared to touch the Safite's elbow lightly with one finger. "Are you taking him to the—" He had not the strength to finish, and Hamilcar stopped, amazed at such grief. He had never thought, so immense was the gulf separating the one from the other, that there could be anything in common between them. It even appeared to him to be a sort of outrage, an encroachment on his own privileges. He replied by a look, colder and heavier than the axe of an executioner. The slave fainted and dropped in the dust at his feet. Hamilcar stepped over him. The 3 black-robed men waited in the great hall, standing against the stone disk. All at once the Safite tore his garments and rolled upon the stones, uttering sharp cries. "Ah, poor little Hannibal! Oh, my son, my consolation, my hope, my life! Kill me also! Take me! Misery, misery!" He plowed his face with his fingernails and tore out his hair, howling like the mourners at funerals. "Take him away! I suffer too much! Go, go! Kill me with him!" The servitors of Moloch were astonished that the great Hamilcar possessed such a faint heart. They were almost touched. Just then, the noise of naked feet was heard, and with a jerking rattle, like the panting of a ferocious beast when running in pursuit, on the threshold of the 3rd gallery, between the ivory doorposts, a man appeared, pallid, trembling, with outstretched arms, screaming, "My child!" With a bound, Hamilcar fell upon him, covering his mouth with his hands and exclaiming still more loudly, "He is the old slave who reared Hannibal. He calls him my child. He will become mad. Enough, enough!" and pushing out the 3 priests and their victim, he went out with them and closed the door behind him with a tremendous kick. For some time Hamilcar listened attentively, fearing they might return. He next thought of killing the slave, to make sure of his not speaking, but the peril had not completely passed, and his death, if the gods were angered at it, might return upon his own son. Then, changing his purpose, he sent to him by Tanakh the best things from his kitchen, a quarter of a goat, some beans, and preserved pomegranates. The slave, who had not eaten for a long time, flung himself upon the food, whilst his tears fell into the dishes. Hamilcar now returned to Salammbô and unknotted Hannibal's cords. The child was so exasperated that he bit the Safit's hand until he drew blood. He repulsed him with a caress. To keep the boy quiet, Salammbô tried to frighten him with stories of Lamia, an ogress of Cyrene. "Where is she?" he asked. He was told that the brigands would come to put him in prison, to which he replied, "When they come, I shall kill them." Hamilcar then told him the frightful truth, but he grew angry with his father, declaring that he was able to exterminate the people, since he was the master of Carthage. At last, exhausted by his struggles and anger, he slept a savage sleep, talking in his dreams as he lay with his back propped up against a scarlet pillow, his head thrown a trifle backward, and his little arm extended out straight from his body in an imperious attitude. When the night grew dark, Hamilcar lifted the child in his arms and descended the stairway of the galleys without a torch. In passing through the commercial house, he took a bunch of grapes and a jug of pure water. The child awakened before the statue of Aletes in the vault of gems, and smiled, as the other child had smiled, in the arms of the Safit, at the splendors surrounding him. Hamilcar was very certain that no one could now take his son. It was an impenetrable spot, communicating with the shore by a subterranean passage that he alone knew. He cast his eyes about him, inhaling a long breath, and placed the boy on a stool beside some golden shields. No one at present could see them. He had nothing more to heed, and he gave way to his feelings. Like a mother who finds her lost firstborn, he embraced his son, pressing him to his heart. He laughed and wept at the same time, calling him by the most endearing names, and covered him with kisses. Little Hannibal, frightened by this terrible tenderness, remained silent. Hamilcar returned with slow steps, feeling along the walls around him, until he reached the large hall, wherein the moonlight entered through one of the slits in the dome. In the middle the slave slept, lying at full length on the marble. He regarded him, and was moved by a kind of pity. With the toe of his buskin he pushed a rug under his head. Then he lifted his eyes and gazed at Tanit, whose slender crescent was shining in the sky. He felt himself stronger than the balls, and contemptuous of them. The preparations were already being made for the sacrifice. A portion of the wall in the temple of Moloch was removed in order to pull the brazen god through without disturbing the ashes on the altar. As soon as the sun rose, the sacred slaves of the temple pushed it towards the square of Khamûn. It moved backward, sliding over cylinders. Its shoulders overtopped the walls. From the farthest distance, the Carthaginians who perceived it fled hastily, for the ball could not be contemplated with impunity save in the exercise of his wrath. An odor of aromatics was wafted through the streets. All the temples were thrown open simultaneously, and tabernacles upon chariots or on litters carried by pontiffs came forth. Great feathered plumes nodded at their corners, and rays flashed from their pointed spires, terminated by globes of crystal, gold, silver, or copper. These were the Canaanitish Baalim, reproductions of the supreme Baal, returning toward their essence to humble themselves before his might and be lost in his magnificence. The canopy of Melkart, of fine purple, sheltered a flame of bitumen oil, while upon that of Khamûn, which was of hyacinth color, was erected an ivory phallus bordered with a circle of gems. Between the curtains of Eskmoon, blue as the ether, a python slept, describing a circle with its tail. And the Dii Pateki, held in the arms of their priests, resembled large infants in swaddling clothes, with their feet brushing the ground. Following came all the inferior forms of divinity: Baal Shamin, god of celestial spaces; Baal Peor, god of sacred mountains; Baal Zebub, god of corruption, and those of the neighboring countries and of cognate races; the Yarbal of Libya, the Adramelech of Chaldea, the Kejun of the Syrians, Derketo with her maiden's face creeping upon her fins; and the body of Tammuz was transported on a catafalque between torches and heads of hair. To subdue the kings of the firmament to the sun, and prevent their individual influence from impeding his, metal stars of diverse colors were brandished on the ends of long staves. In this collection all were found, from the black Nebo, which was the genius of Mercury, to the hideous Rahab, the constellation of the crocodile, the abadirs, stones fallen from the moon, revolved in silver filigree slings. Small loaves representing the female sex were carried in baskets by the priests of Ceres. Others brought their fetishes, their amulets, forgotten idols reappeared, and they had even taken from the ships their mystic symbols, as though Carthage desired to concentrate herself completely in one thought of death and desolation. Before each of the tabernacles a man balanced on his head a vase of smoking incense. Clouds hovered here and there, and through the dense vapors could be discerned the hangings, the pendants, and the embroideries of the sacred pavilions. In consequence of their enormous weight, they advanced slowly. The axle trees of the chariots occasionally got caught in the narrow streets. Then the devotees profited by the opportunity to touch the Baalim with their clothing, which they afterwards preserved as sacred relics. The brazen statue continued to advance towards the square of Khamun. The rich, carrying scepters with emerald balls, started from the far end of Megara. The elders, crowned with diadems, assembled in Kanisto, and the masters of finance, the governors of provinces, merchants, soldiers, sailors, and the numerous horde employed at funerals, all displaying the insignia of their magistracy or the instruments of their calling, converged toward the tabernacles that descended from the Acropolis between the colleges of pontiffs. In deference to Moloch, they were all adorned with their most splendid jewels. Diamonds sparkled on their black apparel, but their rings, now too large, fell loosely from their emaciated hands. And nothing could be more mournful than that silent concourse, where brilliant earrings dangled against pallid faces, while gold tiaras encircled foreheads that were wrinkled by profound despair. Finally the Baal attained the center of the square. His pontiffs made an enclosure with trellises to keep back the multitude, and prostrated themselves at his feet, surrounding him. The priests of Khamun, in reddish woolen robes, stood in line before their temple beneath the columns of the portico. Those of Eskmun, in white linen mantles, with necklaces of hoopoe heads and conical tiaras, established themselves on the steps of the Acropolis. The priests of Melkart, in violet tunics, took their position on the western side. The priests of the Abadirs, encircled in bands of Phrygian stuffs, placed themselves on the eastern side, and ranged on the southern side with the necromancers, entirely covered with tattooings, were the shriekers in patched mantles, the priests of the Dei Pateki, and the Yiddinim, who foretold the future by placing a bone from a dead body in their mouths. The priests of Ceres, habited in blue robes, had prudently stopped in Satheb Street, and were intoning in a low voice a Thesmophorian and Megarian dialect. From time to time files of men arrived, completely naked, with arms stretched out, holding each other by the shoulders, giving vent from the depths of their chests to hoarse, cavernous intonations. Their eyes were turned toward the Colossus, which shone through the dust, and at intervals they swayed their bodies in unison, as if shaken by a single movement. In such a frenzy were these men that the sacred slaves could quiet them only by beating them with sticks, and making them lie flat on the ground with their faces against the brazen trellises. At this moment, from the back of the square, a man in a white robe came forward. As he slowly penetrated the throng, he was recognized as a priest of Tanit, the high priest, Shahabarim. Yells were raised, for the tyranny of the male principle prevailed upon this occasion in all minds, and the goddess was so completely forgotten that no one had even noticed the absence of her pontiffs. But the wonderment doubled when her high priest was seen to open one of the gates of the trellis, intended to admit only those who would offer victims for the sacrifice. The priests of Moloch, believing that he came to offer an insult to their god, endeavored to expel him with excited gestures. Nourished as they were by the sacrificial meats, clothed in purple like kings, and wearing triple crowns, they were contemptuous of this pale eunuch priest, emaciated by fasting. An insolent laughter shook their black beards, spread out over their breasts in the sunlight. Shahabarim, without response, continued to walk forward, crossing, step by step, the whole enclosure, until he arrived beneath the legs of the colossus. Then he threw out his arms and touched it on both sides. This was a solemn act of adoration. Too long the rabbet had tortured him, and in despair, or perhaps for lack of a god completely satisfying to his mind, he had decided at last to accept Moloch. The crowd, shocked by this apostasy, uttered a prolonged murmur. They felt that the last tie uniting them to a merciful deity had been severed. But Shahabarim, because of his mutilation, could not participate in the cult of Baal. The men in red mantles expelled him from the enclosure. Then, when he was outside, he walked around all the other colleges successively, and the priest, now having no god, disappeared in the crowd which scattered at his approach. Meantime a fire of aloes, cedar, and laurel wood burned between the legs of the colossus. Its long wings buried their points in the flame. The unguents with which it had been rubbed trickled like sweat over its brazen limbs. Above the circular stone on which its feet rested, children, enveloped in black veils, formed a motionless circle, and its inordinately long arms allowed the palms of the hands to reach down to them, as if to seize this crown and lift it to the sky. The rich, the elders, the women, and in fact the entire multitude, thronged behind the priests, and on the terraces of the houses. The large, painted stars revolved no longer. The tabernacles were set on the ground, and the smoke from the censers rose on high perpendicularly, like gigantic trees spreading their bluish boughs amid the azure. Many fainted, others became inert and petrified in their ecstasy. Infinite agony oppressed their hearts. The noises one by one went out, and the people of Carthage waited in silence, absorbed in their terrified desire. At last the high priest of Moloch passed his right hand beneath the children's veils, and pulled out a lock of hair from each of their foreheads, which he threw into the flames. Then the men in red mantles intoned a sacred hymn. Homage to thee, O Son, King of the two zones, Creator, self-begotten, Father and Mother, Father and Son, God and Goddess, Goddess and God. And their voices were lost in the outburst of countless instruments, sounding in unison to smother the cries of the victims. The sheminith with 8 strings, the kinnor with 10, and the nebel with 12, all twanged, whistled, and thundered forth. Enormous leathern bottles struck full of tubes made a sharp clashing noise. The tambourines, beaten as hard as possible, resounded with heavy, rapid blows, and despite the fury of the clarions, the salsalim clicked like the wings of locusts. With a long hook, the sacred slaves opened the 7 compartments contained in the body of the Baal. Into the highest division meal was introduced, into the second 2 turtle doves, into the third an ape, into the fourth a ram, into the fifth a lamb, and in the 6th, as they did not possess an ox, a tanned hide from the sanctuary was substituted. The 7th aperture remained gaping and empty. Before a human victim should be offered, it was well to test the arms of the god. Slender chainlets, passing from the fingers over the shoulders, descended at the back. These men pulled forward, raising to the height of its elbows 2 open hands that, in approaching each other, closed over its belly. They worked them several times successively with little jerks. Then the musical instruments were dumb, and the fire roared fiercely. The pontiffs of Moloch walked to and fro on the large stone slab, inspecting the multitude. The first offering must be an individual sacrifice, an oblation perfectly voluntary, which would include the others along with it. but no one came forward, and the 7 alleys leading from the barrier to the Colossus remained completely empty. To stimulate the people, the priests pulled from their girdles little stilettos with which they slashed their faces. The devotees, who were stretched on the ground outside, were brought into the enclosure, and a bundle of horrible iron was thrown to them. Each one chose his torture. They passed spits through their breasts, slit their cheeks, put upon their heads crowns of thorns. Then they enlaced their arms together, and surrounding the children, they formed another great circle which kept contracting and expanding. When they reached the balustrade, they threw themselves back, only to eddy outward again, continually calling the crowd's attention to themselves by the dizziness of their movements, accompanied by blood and cries. Gradually the people, thus incited, came into the end of the alleys, and threw into the flames pearls, gold vases, cups, all their treasures, and torches. These offerings became more and more splendid, and kept multiplying. Presently a man who staggered, a man pale and hideous from terror, thrust forward a child. Then a small black mass could be distinguished between the hands of the Colossus. It disappeared into the dark opening. The priests leaning over the edge of the large slab, and a new chant burst out, celebrating the joys of death and of new birth into eternity. The children mounted slowly, and as the smoke rose in lofty, whirling masses, they seemed from afar to disappear in a cloud. Not one faltered. All had been bound hand and foot, and the dark drapery prevented them from seeing anything, and from being recognized. Hamilcar, in a red mantle, like the priests of Moloch, stood near the Baal, upright before the great toe of its right foot. When the 14th child was led forward, all saw that he made a gesture of horror, but quickly resumed his attitude of composure. He crossed his arms and gazed on the ground. On the other side of the Colossus, the Grand Pontiff likewise remained motionless, bowing his head, upon which was an Assyrian mitre, and watching on his breast the gold plaque covered with prophetic stones, which threw out iridescent lights as the flame struck across them. He grew pale and abstracted. Hamilcar inclined his head, and they were both so near the funeral pyre that the hem of their robes in rising from time to time swept it. Moloch's brazen arms moved more rapidly. They no longer paused. Each time a child was placed upon them, the priests of Moloch extended their hands over the victim to lay upon it the sins of the people, vociferating, "These are not men, but oxen." And the multitude round repeated, "Oxen, oxen." The devotees screamed out, "Lord, eat." And the priests of Proserpine, conforming in terror to Carthage's need, mumbled their Eleusinian formula, "Pour forth rain, conceive." No sooner were the victims placed on the edge of the aperture than they vanished, like a drop of water on a red-hot plate, and white smoke curled up through the scarlet glow. Yet the appetite of the god was not appeased. He still wanted more. In order to supply him, the children were piled on his hands and were held there by a great chain. At first the devotees tried to count them, in order to see if the total number corresponded to the days of the solar year, but now so many were piled on that it was impossible to distinguish them in the dizzy motion of those horrible arms. All this lasted a long time, until nightfall. Then the belly of the god began to glow more somberly. Burning flesh was now visible. Some even fancied that they recognized hair, limbs, and entire bodies. Night fell. Clouds gathered over the head of the ball. The pyre, now flameless, made a pyramid of glowing embers that reached to his knees, and all crimson, like a giant covered with blood. With head bent backward, he seemed to reel under the weight of his intoxication. As the priests hastened, the frenzy of the people increased. As the number of victims diminished, some cried out to spare them, others that Moloch must have more. It seemed as if the walls, with their masses of spectators, would crumble beneath the shrieks of horror and of mystic ecstasy. True believers entered the alleys, dragging their children, who clung to them, and they beat their little hands to make them loose their hold, that they might deliver them to the red men. Occasionally, the musicians stopped from sheer exhaustion, and in the lull could be heard the screams of mothers and the crackling of the grease falling on the coals. The mandrake drinkers crept on all fours around the colossus, roaring like tigers. The Yiddanim prophesied, the devotees sang with their cleft lips. The trellis work was broken, for all wanted to participate in the sacrifice, and fathers whose children were long dead cast into the yawning furnace their effigies, toys, and preserved bones. Those who possessed knives rushed upon the others. They cut one another's throats in their voracious rage. The sacred slaves, with bronze winnowing baskets, took the falling cinders from the edge of the stone slab, tossing them high in the air, that the sacrifice might be dispersed over the entire city and ascend to the region of the stars. The tumultuous noise and vast illumination had drawn the barbarians to the very foot of the walls. Climbing upon the ruins of the Heliopolis to have a better view, they looked on, gasping with horror. And on that happy note, that's going to conclude our selections from Salammbô. Truly a masterpiece. Not exactly a feel-good novel, but one of the great ones. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. It was fun for me to finally get back into this book and to share some of my favorite parts with you. If this is something you enjoyed, feel free to like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And until next time, happy reading.